These shocking images have baffled scientists. Many oddities in history demonstrate that reality can sometimes be stranger than fiction. In this video, we'll explore some of the most bewildering photos that continue to perplex experts worldwide. Here are a collection of rare historical real photos that scientists cannot explain. Number 1. Spirit photography pioneer. William Hope, born in 1863 in Cheshire in the United Kingdom, was known for his spiritual investigations and his photography. The British man had formed the Crew Circle Spiritualist group after he produced the first ever spirit image in 1905. A few years later, in 1922, the Society of Psychical Research and Harry Price, the paranormal investigator, had attempted to disprove Hope's work. Despite this, the photographer maintained a strong following. Pictured here were two of the man's alleged spirit photographs, of which there are numerous amounts. An exceptional collection of images was discovered in a Lancashire antiquarian bookshop by a curator at the National Media Museum. After some investigation, it was established that these were the works of the controversial medium. Hope had begun his life as a carpenter but would become rather interested in spirit photography in 1905, after he snapped an image of a ghost while photographing his friend. It was thereafter that the aforementioned group was formed, consisting of 6 spirit photographers. After the First World War, support for the circle and demand for its services grew. This was due to the grieving relatives of those who'd not come out of the war seeking a means of contacting their lost ones. It had also been in 1922 when the spiritualist had moved to London and established himself as a professional medium. It was in this year that Price would collect evidence that Hope was substituting glass plates that had some ghostly images on them to produce these images. The process of producing this effect of ghostly apparitions was said to have first been discovered by William Mumler, who was also into spiritualism along with his wife Hannah Mumler, who was a famous healing medium. It was alleged that the photographer had in the 1860s accidentally taken 2 pictures of himself using the same photographic plate, which is what Harry Price accused Hope of. Mumler's most famous spirit photograph was that of a portrait of Mary Todd Lincoln, the wife of United States President Abraham Lincoln. It was in this image that Mary was being consoled by her late husband's ghost. It was also during this same era that 2 young cousins, Elsie Wright and Frances Griffiths, had made use of cardboard illustrations of fairies to produce the illusion that they were being visited by mythical flying creatures. The images were quite obviously not as sophisticated as that of Hope's, but they still captured the imagination of the public and had some believing that not only did we have ghosts among us, but fairies as well. The cousins later admitted that this was a prank, but 2 of the infamous photographs were sold for over £2,000 at an auction. Hope's most ardent supporters, however, came to his defense, with the most famous being that of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who'd written The Case for Spirit Photography as a response to the claims. Hope's career pressed on well until his passing in 1933. The left-hand image shows a couple seated for their photograph, who was later believed to be their daughter who appeared in a ghostly form between them. Another image of a younger couple was taken in 1920 with yet another image of a female specter appearing behind them. While Price had supposedly debunked Hope's images, there existed a few that seemed to be rather strange. One of which was a man who had his picture taken and the ghost of his wife appeared beside him. How would Hope have gotten a hold of an image of the man's wife and put it on a glass plate? How did he even know that this man in particular would at some point be his client? There were multiple images labeled from elderly man with spirit to Will Thomas with an unidentified spirit. It had not been images of people's portraits though. There was one image titled Couple with a Spirit in Their Car. In the seat of the couple's car, a man's ghost can be seen looking toward the camera. It was later established that this was the ghost of the couple's son. It was also not only ghosts that appeared in these images, as one image revealed signs of a presence with swirls wrapping around the man and into the surrounding space. Ghostly bodies that loomed from swirling clouds and the faces of the departed rose to popularity during the 20th century. These ghosts were only able to be captured by the cameras of Lens and are certainly fascinating to behold, even if they were dubbed as entirely fake. In another ghostly picture, 3 elderly individuals are accompanied by 2 spirits, both of whom appear to be women. He'd also taken a picture during a meeting of the Society for the Study of Supernormal Pictures where many individuals can be seen standing or sitting in the frame, but they're not alone. A face can be seen in the center of this picture surrounded by cloudy whiteness. At least 4 of the attendees are looking around instead of focusing on the camera. It's almost as if they could see something before them as well. It was also in this picture that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle can be seen sitting in the center row, second from the left. The Crew Circle had later gained notoriety after the inclusion of Thomas Keithley, who was an eccentric and verified the powers that Hope allegedly possessed. He had also championed the photographer's work to the public and gifted him his very first standing camera. As mentioned, one of Hope's biggest supporters was Sir Arthur, the author of Sherlock Holmes. He was a prominent figure in the success of the spiritualist and was an avid spiritualist himself, as well as a strong believer in spirit photography. The author was also a member of the Society for the Study of Supernormal Pictures, hence why he appears in the image of the group. He would go on to defend both Hope's reputation as well as his work for the rest of his life. While the claims of photographing spirits on camera today or other paranormal events are scrutinized and quickly debunked, Hope's supporters were readily seduced by the possibility of capturing an otherworldly visit from a departed relative or a loved one. Hope's timing had been what led to his success. These pictures were produced during the earlier 20th century, during the time of the war, a time embraced by grievance. It had been the hope for proof that even in their passing, the loved one's presence in our world remains and that there was life on the other side. In a testimony given by one of Hope's clients, W. Whitefield had stated that he and his wife had not the slightest doubt that the image was of one of their daughters. He furthered this by saying that he prayed that this knowledge would bring both joy and comfort to a sorrowful heart. While William Hope's spirit photography may or may not have been real, he still brought comfort to those distressed families who were in need. Number 2. Maria Callas' operatic journey. Greek soprano Maria Callas was one of the most iconic opera singers of the 20th century. She was born in 1923 and at the age of 13 years old, her journey of musical education began in Greece. Her first vocal lessons were undertaken by Maria Travella at the Greek National Conservatory. The girl's low contralto voice then raised and lightened to a soprano. Then, in the 1940s, Maria became the pupil of Elvira de Hidalgo, a much celebrated soprano at the Athens Conservatory. Maria's teacher described her as a phenomenon. At the age of 18 years old, she would go on to make her professional opera debut in Athens in August of 1942. Throughout the rest of her career, this was the role that she was most associated with. It was also during this time that Greece had been struck with wartime hardships, and Maria's mother forced her to go out with German soldiers in order to get food and money. The relationship between the two quickly dwindled, and by 1950, Maria ceased all contact with her mother. By the time she returned to New York in 1945 at the age of 21, she'd given 56 performances from a repertoire of 7 operas. The Greek period was considered to be the foundation of her career, but others believed that her return to the United States had really marked the start of her opera career. Throughout the 1950s, the singer had made appearances in the world's most notable opera houses, including La Scala in Milan, Covent Garden in London, the Lyric Theatre in Chicago, and New York's Metropolitan Opera. Her high-profile performances, though, did not come without offstage drama. Maria had a large falling out with Rudolph Bing, the Met Opera general manager. There had been a well-known rivalry with another international soprano of that period known as Renata Tebaldi. There exists an incredibly famous image of her that circulated for some time, awarding her the name, the Tigress. The picture was taken on the 17th of November, 1955 after Maria had come off stage from her performance of Madama Butterfly in Chicago. It was after her performance that U.S. Marshal Stanley Pringle and Deputy Sheriff Dan Smith had burst into the singer's dressing room and served her with a court summons on the grounds of a breached contract. Maria was absolutely furious and chased the officers from her dressing room. She threw the paper on the floor before proclaiming, "I will not be sued. I have the voice of an angel. No man will sue me." It was at this point that her furious snarl had been photographed. Maria had been handed these papers following a lawsuit that was brought by Edgar Richard Bagarozzi, who had claimed to be her agent in December of 1945. Eddie had discovered the young singer in New York and, impressed with her potential, he went on to arrange for her to take lessons with his wife Louise. Louise claimed to have provided Maria with 13 months of free singing lessons. It was at the same time that another man, Ottavio Scotto, was in the process of opening an opera company based in Chicago. It was his intention to showcase European artists who were cut off from the United States by the war or for those who'd come to light since the war. Eddie became excited about the prospects for his new star and agreed to go into business with Ottavio and contributed $100,000 to the agreed partnership. The United States Opera Company was due to premiere in 1947 with a production of Turandot starring Maria. At the last moment, though, the money ran out and the show was canceled and the company was disbanded. It was thereafter that things became a bit murky. It was, according to Eddie, that after the Chicago failure, he had arranged for Maria's first Italian engagement through Giovanni Zenatello, the director of the Verona Opera. He claimed to have acted as Maria's agent with her signed documented consent not only for this engagement but for all of her Italian engagements. After the opera singer became rich and famous in November of 1954, Eddie would sell the remainder of her 10-year contract to the Zenatello Management Company. He would then go on to sue her for $100,000, which was later upped to $300,000. He claimed that this would cover 10% of her estimated earnings from 1947 up until 1954. As previously mentioned, after her Madama Butterfly performance, she was photographed with a furious smile which aided and gave rise to the myth that Maria was a temperamental prima donna. Maria had denied having any professional relationship with both Eddie and Louise and called the entire ordeal an enormous lie. She further claimed that the contract was signed under duress. Eventually, the case was settled out of court in the middle of July. In 1950, Eddie had yet again found himself on the wrong side of the law and was charged with fraud. It's been alleged that she was so incredibly famous that non-opera fans had known of her. Another part of Maria's life that became a widely known aspect is when she was broken up with by Aristotle Onassis. Onassis was one of the wealthiest people in the world at the time. He'd left the singer after the assassination of John Kennedy to be with Jackie Kennedy, but he kept seeing Maria until his passing. It was also during the 1950s that Maria was at the height of her career and commanded the highest of fees, but her vocal problems were starting to become a lot more evident. It appeared that she had some unevenness in her vocal registers as well as pronounced tremolo on high notes. Some had even debated that a loss of weight was becoming more noticeable between 1953 and 54, stating that this weight loss had been the cause of vocal issues and that she had inadequate training. Come the 1960s then, the singer began to withdraw from the stage, guessed to be due to the issues with her voice, but there were some changes in her personal life as well. Maria's final appearance came in July of 1965 at Covent Garden. She was the age of 41 years old, which is generally the age that most sopranos are at their peak. It was later determined that the opera singer had suffered from a rare disease that affects tissue and muscles. Number 3. Paranormal Investigator. While this image may appear to be a simple picture of a man in his library smoking a pipe, it's actually that of Harry Price, the British psychic researcher, surrounded by his ghost hunting equipment. He was born in Victorian London in 1881 and grew up with an interest in archaeology, magic, and conjuring. He would go on to spend a good portion of his youth perfecting his conjuring skills and working out magic tricks. Harry would become such a good conjurer that he was accepted into the magic circle in the United Kingdom and was later elected to the Society of American Magicians. He would also put together and refine his own guidelines for investigations into alleged hauntings or for debunking a seance. He'd invested in some of the early ghost hunting and ghost detecting equipment later in life. While Harry had aboard the tricks that were made use of by some charlatans who'd claimed to be in contact with the spirit world to gain money off of others' grief and would expose them where he could, he was also a genuine believer in the paranormal. He believed that some of these mediums were honest and certain messages were in fact from the spirit world. He also came to find out that some of the ghosts that he researched were also real. In 1927, he became a member of the Ghost Club, which closed down in 1936. 18 months later, though, he reopened it as a dining club where some prominent experts would give dinner talks. It was also after this that women were allowed to join the Ghost Club for the first time. Harry would proceed to build a large library of books, case files, and even documents that related to his ghost hunting career and the occult, which he then bequeathed to the University of London. He's authored some notable works, over 20 books, including The Most Haunted House in England, Poltergeist over England, and The End of Borley Rectory. These books are still consulted and are regarded as classics today. One of Harry's most famous investigations was in 1927 and was known as Joanna Southcott's box. A mysterious box was alleged to contain a series of prophecies by Joanna Southcott, a mystic, that was only to be opened during the time of national peril in the presence of the Church of England's bishops, of which there were 24. Calls had been made for the box to be opened during the Crimean War and the Great War, but it was not investigated until 1927 when it came into the hands of Harry. It was rumored thereafter that the box was x-rayed and others say it was opened, but according to the story, a firearm, a lottery ticket, books, a purse, a dice box, and a nightcap were found within it. It was suggested that this was not the real box and that Harry had only used it to gain publicity for his newly formed National Laboratory of Psychical Research. The prophetess was born in 1750 and had written a few volumes of divine revelations. She announced that at the age of 64, she would give birth to a savior named Shiloh. The box was later bequeathed to posterity. It's uncertain if Harry had opened the real box, or if he'd been truthful in what the contents were. Eileen Garrett, born in 1893, was said to have been one of the most respected mediums of her time. It was alleged that she had a tragic life. During much of her childhood, she suffered from respiratory problems and would leave her homeland at the age of 15. Her children never saw adulthood and her husband was struck down during the war. It was thereafter that her psychic abilities began to develop. She and Harry came into contact in the spring of 1923 when she attended the sitting that he organized at the rooms of the London Spiritualist Alliance. In 1930, Harry and Eileen sat down to perform a séance to contact the deceased Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, a friend of Harry's, but during this, Eileen was overpowered by an entity identified as Flight Lieutenant H. Carmichael Irwin, who met his demise in a crash of the airship R-101 2 days earlier. Irwin went on to give a detailed appraisal as to what had gone wrong in the airship, including information about the construction and powering of the dirigible. The information was later checked and 70% of it was found to be accurate. The Brocken experiment was another one of Harry's famous cases. In 1932, he journeyed to the Harz Mountains in Germany in order to take part in celebrations of the poet Goethe. It was here that he would go on to carry out a magical ritual that was found in a manuscript that the National Laboratory had obtained a year prior. The following refers to a part of Chapter 20, Pale Black Magic, of Harry Price's Confessions of a Ghost Hunter. It was in this part that he describes the events of his trip to the Brocken. Page 334 quotes, "Among the peasants of certain parts of Germany, especially the Harz district, witchcraft is still accepted as fact. In the spring of 1932, I did my best to enlighten the natives by introducing to the celebrations a magical experiment known as Blocksberg Tryst. The Blocksberg Tryst refers to a ritual that was designed to turn a young male goat into a human boy." Page 335 continues, "The MS is written in an early 19th century hand in faded brown ink, almost illegible in places. In the center of the MS is the magic circle, painted in two colors, red and blue with the usual symbols. On the reverse of the MS is an engraving of the town of Bacharach on the Rhine by the German artist R. Putner. It was in the pages following this that Harry Price went on to detail exactly what the Blocksberg Tryst had entailed. It was detailed here that the apex of triangle was to direct to the Tower of Castle, and the base would cover a village in the eastern Harz Mountains. After all the symbols had been plotted according to the book, the servants are to take their places and the woman must be beside the goat, of which a young man is required. While Harry's experiments did produce a great deal of publicity, it did not produce the transformation itself. Thereafter, Harry explained that the failure was due to the clicking of cameras and the light that came from them, in addition to the fact that the fires had been too fierce and the woman's Latin incantations were not word perfect. Some minor details of the experiment were also incorrectly placed. It was attempted again the following day, but the goat remained a goat. It would later be stated in the pages that the idea behind the staging was to ridicule the idea of the magic ritual under modern conditions. Another one of Harry's most famous cases was that of the Borley Rectory, also known as the most haunted house in England. The supernatural investigator had documented activity consistent with that of a poltergeist. This included the ringing of the servant's bell, which would do so of its own accord. Phantom footsteps would be heard and unexplained lights would appear through the windows. There had also been spirit messages in the house along with the strange throwing of stones that would go on to occur later, further distressing the family. It had also been in 1937 that Harry attended a private séance in which a young girl named Rosalie had appeared. He had detailed that he would control the room by placing starch powder over the floor, locking the door, and taping the windows before beginning the séance. In his writing, he would describe this event as materialization, which he said was a phenomenon of which he could not describe. It had been during the sitting that Rosalie would make her presence known by clasping her mother's hand. She would also respond to questions, mainly to her mother, with simple answers like yes and no. And so the following image was not just that of a random man in a study, it was Harry Price, the paranormal investigator who not only investigated hauntings but also exposed charlatans who would take money from grieving families. Harry Price remains one of the most famous English ghost hunters to this day. Number 4. Rothschild's Surrealist Ball. This image of elaborate masks was taken at the 1972 Rothschild Surrealist Ball. The masks, decorations, and attire were unsettling enough all on their own before one was to consider those who are behind them. The Rothschild family was subject to wild conspiracy theories, with believers claiming that the banking family did everything from control the world's wealth to instigating wars for their own gain. Whether such rumors are true or not, the imaginations of outsiders have only fueled wild theories as to what may go on behind closed doors at parties that are attended by the powerful, rich, and famous individuals. This image was captured on the 12th of December in 1972, when the elite guest list had gathered at the home of Marie-Helene de Rothschild. Marie was the wife of Baron Guy of the French banking dynasty. It was said that she was well known for her lavish hospitality and the incredible parties of which she held during the 1960s and 70s. The guests who attended the party would receive invitations that were written backward and had to be held up to a mirror in order to be read. In this case, the dress code had been a black tie, long dresses, and surrealist heads. The host on this night had worn a stag's head with tears made from diamonds. Château de Ferrières was said to be one of the largest and most luxurious 19th century chateaus in France. Guy's ancestor Baron James had seen his cousin's rather impressive Mentmore towers and had his architect build him a Mentmore but twice the size. The chateau boasted 80 guest bedrooms, 30 square kilometers of forest, a central hall of 120 feet, Atlas columns, and a caryatids that had been sculpted by Charles Cordier. In addition, there had also been a library that consisted of over 80,000 volumes as well as a neo-Renaissance Italian garden. Château de Ferrières was occupied during the Franco-Prussian War and then again by the Germans in the Second World War. It thereafter stood empty until 1959 when Marie-Helene had made the decision to revitalize it. It was after this that it would become a sensualist epicenter for European high society. A mixture of nobility, stars, artists, fashion designers, and musicians all attended such balls. The parties were so attractive and so appealing that if one were not invited to the next one, they would certainly have a mental breakdown. The front of the house was lit up as if it were in flames, and along the staircase, servants and footmen were dressed as cats. They pawed at one another or pretended to be asleep. Upon their entry, the invited guests, all in their strange attire, were led through a maze. The maze was an extraordinary immersive theatrical experience, set in a forest of cobweb ribbon that was full of dark surprises. If one were to get lost in the interesting maze, they could call one of the cat helpers for assistance. Once the guests were led into the dinner room, they found that the plates had been covered in fur and the table's centerpieces were taxidermized tortoises. Food had also been served on a mannequin that was placed on a bed of roses. They also came to find that their eating utensils had been replaced with fish. The menu was strewn with cannibalistic puns such as sirloin and extra lucid soup, or even goat's cheese roasted in sadness. Some of the attendees came with striking appearances. As previously mentioned, Marie wore a stag's head with real diamonds as tears, but some of the others may have outdone her. Audrey Hepburn had an innocent-looking cage that was filled with birds among other things. While the surrealist artist Salvador Dali had designed many of these costumes and attended the ball, he didn't wear a costume. But the perfumer Helene Roches had worn a gramophone on her head, and another guest had an apple presented before her face, a reference to Magritte's The Son of Man. One of the others had worn a cut-up collage of the Mona Lisa. The attendance of Marissa Berenson, supermodel and star of Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon, foreshadowed his final film called Eyes Wide Shut, and its dreamlike secrecy and opulence. 3 years preceding the unrepeatable Surrealist Ball, the Rothschilds would go on to donate their chateau to the Chancellor of Paris's universities while they moved out and into a house of which they built within the woods of the chateau. There are very few parties that have presented genuine works of art, but the Rothschild Surrealist Ball seems to have been just that. The ball was a social labyrinth, a garden of earthly delights, an immersive theatrical wonder, and luckily for the rest of us, someone took a camera along with them. Of course, it was not all wonder and delight with Rothschild, as conspiracies concerning them went awry. It was theorized, and still is, that the family controls the global finances. They were also alleged to be part of the Illuminati or other secret evil organizations, but that's a chronicle for another time. Number 5. Madame Violet's Vampire Hive. Some years ago, a beautiful, ethereal-looking picture had done the rounds on social media. It was said to be the picture of a Victorian-era woman named Madame Violet of Edinburgh. She was said to have been voted the scariest woman alive in the United Kingdom during the 1800s, twice in 1882 and then 1884. Violet was referred to as the Queen of Edinburgh's Vampire Hive, as it was stated that she was a vampire. The story of the Hive Queen was posted to a blog in 2016, but its authenticity was questionable as no historical documents or stories could prove such a thing. It was said that Violet Spears was born to prosperous farmers on the elegant Scotland outskirts back in 1839. It was alleged here that she had a dramatic mindset from an early age. She loved to draw, sing, and act out performances for her family. Violet's first career had been the usual sort. She married young to a man named Henry Fitzpatrick, and by the time she was 22 years old, she had 4 children, of which 2 were twins. After this, she had no more children and Henry began to stray from her. By the time she was 33 years old, Henry had been in an accident of vague detail and lost his life. It was at this time that her eldest child had married. The 3 remaining children had thereafter gone to live with Violet's sister for the 2 years of mourning. On the 2nd anniversary of Henry's passing, the woman disappeared. Her children had been working the farms at this stage, so she left them with Nancy, presumed to be the sister, along with 3 mourning dresses that were piled atop her bed. Even in her later life, Violet was detailed as a dark individual, and she'd never worn black again. She was not heard from for a year, and small sums of finances began to arrive monthly to Nancy. The money was delivered by a messenger along with a sprig of violets. It was presumed that within this year, Violet had formed a new career, and in 1876 she was referred to as the medium and hypnotist Madame Violet. This career began to attract notoriety in Edinburgh, and the spiritualist gathered a small group of followers. She referred to this group as her hive. The seances thereafter began to become more and more elaborate as she began to use elements of phantasmagoria. Phantasmagoria refers to a sequence of real or imaginary images that one would see in a dream. Vital fluid rituals were gradually introduced into her acts, and clients would be asked to donate a small amount to aid her in connecting with the spirit world. After drinking from a mysterious goblet, Madame Violet reportedly felt euphoric and that an element had been returned to her, one that she'd been missing her whole life. 2 years following this, the seances became a rare ticket. She later abandoned her home life to live with the hive in the Edinburgh vaults. The members would only emerge at night, giving the impression that they were vampires. They soon became known as lively yet dangerous partiers and would seduce men and women. The victims would become so enchanted that they would leave their natural lives to join the hive, but there had been no fatalities. 2 injured individuals did report the happenings to the authorities, but the issues would quietly fade with no arrests or resolutions. The hive members each bore a mark of their sacrifices and brought with them funds, so they were able to live in comfort even in the damp vaults. Madame Violet was said to never leave the vaults unless it were to conduct seances. It was during this that she would wear her elaborate costume as Queen of the Hive. As previously mentioned, she was voted the scariest woman in England, but given that she never left Scotland, this is regarded as unlikely. One attendee of her seances described her as frightening. Over the next decade, the hive continued to expand and would go on to include the son of a prominent council member. It was this that would inevitably be their undoing. It was after this man had gotten an infection after drinking from a goblet that he would condemn the group for acts that were immoral and vile, and for the following years, he used his position to have them disbanded. The vaults were later raided and subsequently closed. Violet relocated to Galashiels, and there she lived with her remaining members. She would go on to pass away in 1930 at the age of 90 years old. She lived the last part of her life modestly and quietly, giving an occasional seance. She'd been denied a burial on consecrated ground given her reputation and was buried outside of the town. A headstone bearing the name Violet Fitzpatrick was erected there. While no concrete evidence that such an event ever existed has come to light, some of the information herein was able to be tracked down. The headstone and Violet Spear's early life were tracked down to an index as made by Jerry Conley. It also gave some information as to who her parents were, but nothing is said as to her career or her vampirism. In addition to this, the Edinburgh vaults do exist and are said to be rather interesting. The vaults are also referred to as the Southbridge vaults, and they consist of a series of chambers formed in the 19 arches of Southbridge, Scotland. For 30 years, the vaults had been used to house taverns, workshops, and cobblers. They later became the hotspots for homeless as well as criminal activity and even storage units for body snatchers, as was so rumored. In the 1820s, some of the citizens of Edinburgh had moved in. By 1860, they'd all left. It was only discovered that humans had inhabited the vaults in 1985 when an excavation revealed toys, medicine bottles, and plates.